Hello everyone, today we are going to make some Christmas cards. I actually made this video almost a year ago and was so close to Christmas that I thought it was too late to just post it, especially if some of you wanted to follow along and make your own Christmas cards as well. I had watched one of Mark Crowley's older videos in which he made a gingerbread Totoro, and I thought it was really cute, and it gave me the idea to draw a regular gingerbread man on a Christmas card. So I used this technique, and I'm sharing it with you right now, and I will also post a link of Mark Crowley's video that inspired me. You gotta go see it, it's really cute. And it just so happened that I had a box of Strathmore Tone Tan greeting cards that came with envelopes, and they were the perfect cards to make those. They're 80 pounds and they're acid free, and they're kind of mixed media type of cards, so they worked very well with all the supplies that I used. Talking about the supplies, I used a Prismacolor goldenrod double-ended brush tip marker and some Prismacolor pencils, a white, a black, a light umber, a dark umber, a yellow ochre, and a couple of grays, and finally a white designer gouache. And because I made quite a few of those cards, I drew a template on a piece of tracing paper, which I traced on a card, and then I flipped over and I traced the other side on another card. Since it was symmetrical, it just, you can trace it on either side, it doesn't really matter. And then once they were traced on the cards, then I just did whatever designs I wanted, like a little girl. I added bows, and in this one in particular, it's one of my favorite, I just turned it into a stunned gingerbread man who got a bite taken out of his head. Once the sketch was finished, I used a kneaded eraser to lighten the pencil marks, and then I used my marker, and I was careful to put a sheet of paper underneath between the two sides of the card, because markers, alcohol-based markers, often bleed through the papers. I didn't want to have marks on the side of the paper on which I was going to write the message. So when you use alcohol-based markers, make sure you protect whatever surface you're working on, or whatever is on the other side of your paper. So with a sheet of regular printer paper, for instance. Anyway, back to the marker. I used it to do my underpainting, if you will. So I just colored the whole gingerbread man with the marker, except that I avoided the frosting part of the cookie, the eyes, the mouth, the buttons and all that. And I didn't have to be too careful to make the coloring very even, because it's just the underpainting, and later on I'm going to add some color pencils on top of it to even out the colors. So just focus there on just covering the whole surface, the whole paper, if you will. Then I added a few crumbs, and to do that I just put little dots or uneven little marks on the paper. That's it. So by the time I was done doing that, the ink on the paper was all dry. So using the exact same marker, I added the shadows. So I decided that the light was coming from the top left. So all the areas that are at the bottom right will have the shadows. So think about the eyes and the eyebrows. These will be done with icing. If it was a real cookie. So the icing has a slight thickness to it. Therefore, there should be a little bit of shadow at the bottom right of it to make it look like it's 3D. Also, the cookie is lying on a surface, whether it's a table or a plate, it doesn't really matter. But there will be also a shadow at the edge of the cookie on the surface on which it's sitting. Then I used a white Prismacolor pencil, and with a very light touch, I started adding some highlights. And the highlights are mostly at the top left of the cookie, because that's where it's gonna catch the light the most. Now, in some areas, I pushed a bit harder on my pencil, like on the edge where the bite was taken out of. And then I realized that as the shadows that I did with the marker dried, they dried a bit lighter, so I went over them a little bit more. So you will see as I kept drawing, as I kept on adding the highlights, I also adjusted the shadows. And again, when you're working on those shadows, keep in mind where the light is coming from. So before you touch the paper with your marker, make sure it's the right place to put your shadow. Alright, so back to my white pencil. Again, I'm using very light pressure because I do not want to add any pencil marks on my cookie. I just want it to be nice and light and well blended. And again, I'm adding it mostly to the edges where the light is hitting the cookie. So now it's time to work on the shadows a bit more. I'm using a light umber pencil, and I know it looks a bit funky, but I'll put a link of why my pencil looks like this. I'm just trying to use it all the way to the last bit. I basically just glued my tiny little stump to a small graphite pencil. Anyway, back to the shadows. I'm kind of doing the same as I did with the marker, or at least I'm doing it in the same area, where I'm lightly coloring the shadow areas, and this time I'm widening the layer a bit more so that the edge of the cookie looks a bit rounder. I'm putting more pressure on the very edge of the cookie, and then as I go towards the inside of the cookie, I'm putting less pressure on my pencil so that the layer gets a little bit lighter and there's a little gradation. I'm always keeping my pencil nice and sharp so that my layer is nice and smooth. And I'm going over all the areas where I had previously added several layers of the marker. Now it's time to even out the surface of the cookie and blend the white highlights with the darker brown. So I used a yellow ochre pencil, and I'm kind of going over the whole cookie, and with light pressure on my pencil I'm just blending everything together. So this step will help even out the surface, especially if there were still some marker strokes visible. And when that's done, I go over the highlights again just to make them stand out even more. And at this point you can already clearly notice the cookie turning into a 3D object with the highlights and the shadows. It really is not flat anymore. Now it's time to make that cookie stand out even more. So on the edge of the cookie, where we want the cookie to look like it's sitting on the table, I used a dark umber pencil and I strengthened that shadow. I'm still using a very sharp pencil, and I make sure that dark line stays very thin. And in some areas where I think the shadow will be even darker, I go over the cookie a little bit with the dark umber, but it's with a very light touch, just like if you're familiar with watercolor, just like a very light glaze, very light layer basically. And now I'm just adjusting the highlights and the shadows to make it look the way I want it to look. I make sure that there is also a nice contrast where there was a bite taken out of the poor cookie's head. Still with the dark umber pencil, it's time to add some texture to the surface of the cookie. Often cookies, they're not perfectly smooth. They have tiny little air bubbles that have burst while the cookie was cooking. It gives it an uneven texture. So right now I'm just adding tiny little dots. I try to cover the whole cookie, but I make sure that they're placed in a very uneven manner. And to make those tiny little holes look three-dimensional, I take my white pencil and I give them all, every single one of them, a highlight, which will be at the bottom right of each little dot, because the light is supposed to reflect on the edge of those holes. And now it's time to work on the shadow of the surface the cookie is resting on. So I used a mid gray, probably like a 50% cool gray, and I lightly add some shadow around the cookie, not all around it. Again, it's always at the bottom right of the cookie where the shadow should be, considering the light is coming from the top left. Then I use a black pencil to darken the shadows even more, but only at the edge of the cookie so that you can see that it's resting on the surface. I apply a lot of pressure right at the edge of the cookie, and then I use a much lighter pressure on my pencil so that it's not as dark, and I go slightly away from the cookie onto the surface, the table or whatever the cookie's resting on, and I try to blend that black with the gray that I had previously put down on the paper. And using light pressure along with very small strokes is a great combination to obtain a smooth layer. And now for the final touch that will make everything pop. I used a permanent white designer gouache by Winsor & Newton, and I made a mix with water that's kind of a milky consistency. And if you find out that it's a bit too liquid for now, and if it becomes transparent when it dries, it means that you've put too much water with it. So you can add another layer with a little bit less water, and it's going to make it look nice and opaque. And that white is the frosting on the cookie, and I think it looks really good. And when you're all done adding your frosting, you can use your pencils again to adjust the lights and the darks to your liking, and you're done. So I made a bunch of those cards last year, and I had a great feedback. Everybody loved them. It did take me a while to make them, but I really enjoyed making them. But anyway, if you like it, I really encourage you to give it a shot. It's really easy to do. It's definitely something that everybody can do if you have the supplies, but don't feel like you have to use the exact same colors. Feel free to use whatever you have. It's art, so anything goes. And you can just change the design. You don't have to make the same cookie. You can make a girl by adding a little skirt and a little bow. You can do anything you want with that particular pattern. It's very easy to do. So I hope you like this video. Let me know in the comments below if you make your own Christmas cards usually. Thank you all for stopping by. If you like this video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to see more. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.